Evening, everyone. I am doing an IG Live with Uju Asika, who wrote this absolutely incredible book, Bringing Up Race, How to Raise a Kind Child in a Prejudiced World. And I'd love you to join in. Tell me where you're coming from. Hello, Scott. Hello, Alex. Hello, Sarah. Lovely that you've joined. Hello, Juliet. Hello, Crazy Grays. Hello, Nikki. Uzu hasn't joined just yet, but I hope that she will. Just allow a few minutes to let her join, and I'm inviting her now. Hopefully, will join us. Hello.
Hello.
Lovely to meet you.
So nice to meet you as well.
I feel like, we were introduced by my daughter, Natasha, but I feel like I know you from your wonderful book.
Uh,
Your book it's very powerful and strong and says, difficult things, but you say it in such a way that I can really read it, but also with humor and warmth. And the things that you kind of talk about of being kind and cool, that your book has a lot of kindness and is very cool.
Thank you. What a lovely thing to say.
I absolutely loved it. So, but before, what I think about it isn't very important. Do you want to kind of introduce yourself, Uju, and say why you wrote the book and what you hope, say, people watching this evening, what they would get from it?
So hi, I'm Uju Asika. I'm a writer, a blogger. I'm a mum of two boys who are both teenagers now.
Wow.
Youngest just turned teenager last week. So
Do you
very,
love saying I'm a writer? Does that feel very cool?
yeah. I think I've been a writer all my life. I'm one of
Ah, okay.
people who really have been writing since, I could hold a pen. So I've always seen myself as a writer, regardless of whether anyone was reading it. So I wrote Bringing Up Race, which I was writing sort of before what I call the summer of the Great Awakening, the summer of 2020.
20.
It before then, and it's interesting because writing the book, I don't know if you felt this when you were reading it, but I felt like I really had to persuade readers that this is a really important topic and everybody has to engage, no matter what your ethnicity, no matter
This
what,
is for everybody. Yeah.
really everybody. So it was really how I wrote the book. And I wrote it from a personal perspective because obviously I'm a Black woman. I was born in Nigeria, raised in the UK, and I'm raising two Black boys. But also, I wanted to get stories from other people, mostly parents. So there's a lot of mothers' voices in the books, and these are mothers of different ethnicities talking about their experiences or lack of experience with race, and how you engage and how you open up these difficult conversations. That's kind of
I'm
what.
just saying that Nikki May Writer said it's such a brilliant book. So you have
Oh,
fans.
I'm
So
a huge Nikki May.
people who, I
That's,
interrupted you. What did you just say?
no, I said I'm a huge fan of Nikki May. She's an author too. Her
Oh,
book
great,
is,
great.
one of
That's
my extended reads. So yeah.
um. I mean, if people want to ask questions, do, and I'll interrupt you to get them. Um, and Mercy Derry, you're saying you need to get my hands on one. You can, and you can buy them, I think, from any good bookstore and obviously online. One of the things you started with in the book was that being a Black author in a publishing world that is 90% white is in itself a kind of massive barrier. Do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit? Because it's obviously me as a white writer that, I just marched in as a white writer, not thinking about my ethnicity at all. It was whether I was a good enough writer and whether I had a book that other people wanted to read. And so you have something that you have to kind of overcome before you even get a word on a page.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's these sort of additional, often invisible barriers that we face, specifically as people of color, and even more specifically as Black people in this world and in this sort of society. And, I think many creatives and certainly many women can relate to having imposter syndrome, that sense that you don't quite belong, or you're not quite good enough. And obviously you get an extra level of imposter syndrome with feeling like, okay, why should my voice be one of the sort of 10% or 5% or whatever
Gosh.
dwindling number has been allocated to Black authors. And there's also that sense of being shoved to the back of the bookstore as a Black author, being sort of,
Really?
which I've experienced before, because I published first in my 20s in an anthology. That was the very first work that I was published in, and it was an anthology of Black authors, and it was so great and such a wonderful experience. But then obviously it just gets relegated to the Afro-Caribbean side of the bookstore, which often doesn't even exist. So yeah, so that's one of those little.
Because I saw there's a bookshop watching, and I wonder if they want to make a comment. Because you're saying that you're not seen as an author, but you're seen as a Black author, and then you put into that slot, into that box, even if there is even that slot.
Yes, if there is that slot. And, and sometimes obviously it's helpful when there were huge discussions around race and all that. Obviously, it's helpful to be a Black author speaking about race, then you might get highlighted and you might get platformed. But then again, it feels like a moment, just like this is the point at which we've spoken about race. Now we've moved on to something else. And then again, you feel like you're not part of the conversation in the way you'd like to be. So yeah, these are just kinds of the things that I wanted people to be aware of, when I was writing, bringing up race, talking about issues. I try not to use big buzzwords, which I didn't use too much in bringing up
You
race. I was
didn't.
quite deliberate about
It was a very honest book. I really felt like your heart was speaking.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I wrote it from the heart, and I wrote it from sense of not wanting, not that I didn't use words like white privilege or white supremacy, or, I use those in the book, but I don't want people to get hung up on, things that become quite sort of divisive and touchy. I wanted people to focus on things like the emotion, the feeling you have when you're with your child in a shop and you're treated a certain way just because of the color of your skin, things like that. So yeah.
Because that's, the most personal is the most universal. So any mother, I mean, you talked about your first experience of racism, which I'd like you to share with us, but also your son's. And all of us, we may kind of feel shame and slightly distance from white supremacy, the words white privilege, whereas hearing a story of your child suffering, there isn't a barrier. We can all connect with that. So do you want to talk about your first experience that you wrote about in the book, and then your son's?
Yeah, so my first experience, funnily enough, I don't even remember my earliest experience, which is when I was at a kindergarten. I must have been about 3, and there was a boy at the
Was that
school.
when you were in London? Because you were in London first, and then you were, yeah.
And I have no memory of it, but my mum told me later, she was like, boy, he used to sort of torment you. And they had to pull me out of that school at that time. And then, as I wrote about it in Bringing Up Race, when I was 7, I went to a boarding school in the south of England. And that's where I had a lot of experiences. And I think the most sort of blatant was obviously somebody who is another child using the N word against me. And
Whoa.
I think, why I wanted to highlight that in the book is not just to put across the fact that, children who are very young are being harmed in this way, but also the fact that this was a child who was
Yeah.
using words. And so, you have to ask yourself, why would my child do that? And where has that child,
Where does the child hear that word?
what does that child think it means? And, what conversations is that child having with their parents or, or even their peers? So these are the questions I kind of wanted to raise and get people thinking about.
And in connection to that, then watching your own child experience it and the confusion. I remember you wrote about when you were first pregnant, you were just so excited to be pregnant. And then there was this kind of dive when you realized you were bringing a black child into the world.
Mm, mm. And yeah, I think that every Black parent, has to go through this, unfortunately. And any parent of color raising their child in a society where they're going to be perceived as the other is going to have to reckon with, how do I talk to my child about the world that they're coming into? How do I deal with it when my child, unfortunately, I think it's more of a when than an
Inevitable, yeah.
my child experiences racism or prejudice or racial bullying, what do I do? Yeah, and it's very emotive and it's very painful, but it's something that we have to reckon with. And this is kind of why, in bringing up race, my whole point is that we have to have these discussions. So if you're a white parent, you should be proactive in having these discussions as well, because it can't just rest on the
That
people who
on
are
people
straight
of color.
for it. You have to be proactive and thinking, I don't want my child to be the one, who goes into the kindergarten or who goes into primary school and is racially abusive to another child.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean that, and you, but in saying that story, you make it all of our job, all of our responsibility to be part of changing the story that has been, you know, devastating for hundreds of years.
Mm.
And affected, you talk about the slave trade, 12 million in the slave trade, 2 million people died, and the sort of eugenics of race that was used against people of color to make whites superior so that we could make them into slaves. And that so we are the beginning of the problem, so we have to be part of the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I was reading a quote by Toni Morrison, who's just, obviously complete her.
Goddess.
And
Yeah.
his birthday was last week, fellow Aquarian. But anyway, and she said, I think I'm going to misquote her, but basically it's along the lines of white supremacy won't end until white people see it as their problem to solve as opposed to a black problem. And I think that's the whole issue with race. Even when you talk about race, as soon as you talk about race, there's a sense of, oh, the black people, or oh, the Asian people, like sort of not taking that responsibility. And I'm very big on accountability and, just being accountable for not even necessarily like what your ancestors have done, but where you are in this particular moment and the power that you have or the privilege that you have and how you can use it in a positive way. So, yeah.
So one of the questions that came up for me reading your book was, so I worked in the NHS for 25 years, and I've worked with many people of color from different, very many different ethnicities. And I mean, maybe this is a difficult question, but if you were a person of color, I mean, when I work with people of color, the first thing I've said for decades, and I'm much more sort of better educated and sensitive now, but what I always started with was when we meet, our histories meet. And so that if I say something that's insensitive, tell me so that I understand, and vice versa. If I don't understand what you're saying, I'll ask. And with that history comes power, and I'm in a position of power as your therapist. So if you ever feel like I'm being insensitive or in some way racially injuring you, tell me. But would your position be that you would prefer to see a person of color as a therapist than a white therapist? Is that a really hard question?
Yeah, I think it's hard, and I think that would be a personal choice on the whole, because just to be personal myself, I've been through counseling, and I remember when I went through the very initial sort of interviews with the organization that I was going with, and they suggested that I could even have a Nigerian
Oh,
therapist.
wow.
And then they also said, actually, would you think that might be a barrier to you? And I said, yes, I do think so. I think it would just be a little bit too close to home.
Close to home.
I would come with all sorts of added layers of like, oh dear, am I sitting with like my Nigerian auntie in a room? How do I begin to express myself? So I think that's more of a personal thing, but I think it's a really important question because obviously race is a factor in every level of society and so many different elements of our personal experience. And there have been a lot of instances of people going into one-on-one counseling and having a very, very difficult experience because the therapist is not only is the therapist not trained on to be racially sensitive, but the therapist is not
Yeah.
even aware. And
Aware.
and that can
I remember people saying to me years ago, on training days, I'm colorblind. And even then, luckily, I realized that wasn't that wasn't something you could
yeah,
be and be a racially sensitive
yeah,
therapist. But
yeah.
they said it with such authority. Um, but of course, the mental health of people of color really suffers as a result. This idea of weathering that you're, a bit like me going into publishing,
Mm.
that Julie, thank you. Loving Julie's new book. Everyone should pre-order it. Thank you, Dr. Julie. That is very nice to read.
I agree.
But vivid cancelling, I totally understand and relate to what you're saying. So what I was saying, Uju, was the weathering of the stress of as a person of color going into white spaces, whether it's a bookshop, whether it's a shop, whether it's a meeting, whether it's being published, that heightens your sense of alert system, your cortisol levels, which of course affect your immune system, your mental health, and that is something that someone like me just completely has no idea about unless I read books like yours.
Yeah, completely. I mean, even I wasn't really as aware of it until I wrote the book and did a lot of research. And, like for instance, this term that you talk about weathering, something that I found out about through my research, and then it clicks into place. You're like, oh, that's what's going on. That is what my experience is. And I think that for me, because I'm always trying to break things down to a simple framework so that obviously parents can talk to their kids about race, but also just that anyone can understand what this feels like. For me, I talk about that when you're experiencing racism, it's not just about the impact of it, it's also the anticipation of
Yeah.
that anticipation.
It's the kind of holding back before you go in, and
It,
that uses up so much energy, and it's a
yeah,
fear, isn't it?
it's
And
a
you
real,
may not get it, but it's am I
it,
going to?
it's there. And I don't want to sort of like center a victim narrative, like we're all running around anticipating racism because, obviously I know in the Black community, we're so multi-layered. We have so many positive, wonderful, joyful experiences
Yeah,
every
you
day.
talk
And a
about that.
real
Yeah,
sense of community, but at the same time, it is a stressful thing, knowing that you're going to open the papers or social media or walk into an office, and very often you're going to experience so many different barriers, some that are more upfront and some that are just invisible, and it changes your day completely.
yeah. And some of those microaggressions, the subtle ones, are sometimes in some ways worse than the upfront kind of actual aggressions. But I also want to turn to the kind of positive side of this wonderful book of, you know, you talk about kindness and fairness and being cool and justice and humanity and the joy of the stories that you tell and the joy of living in London. I mean, that there are certainly barriers. And do you want to kind of tell us some of your philosophy around that and where it came from? I mean, your parents do sound very cool.
Yeah. So the philosophy which I share in the book, which is the title of the final chapter, which is "Be cool, be kind, be you," which is
So
basically,
lovely. It's such
yeah.
a, that's so, I mean, that should be made into wallpaper. Be kind, be
I love that. I
cool,
love that. Yeah, I mean, my parents they were just exceptionally cool and kind individuals, you know, and they didn't sort of have that slogan themselves. Obviously, they didn't run around saying, but they just lived it. That was how they lived, and I think that that's something hopefully, you know, my siblings have kind of inherited, and the way you approach life and the way you relate to people and just your core values. You know, kindness is absolutely everything, and I want to speak about kindness specifically in relation to race because I know that in some instances of people thinking, oh, kindness, what does kindness have to do with racial justice, which I completely understand. But I think
Well,
you've got to,
because it sounds like it's too soft.
yeah, some people think, oh, you know, you can't just tell everyone to be kind. Like, what does that have to do? How does that help us? Well, you've got to
Yeah.
start with, you know, kindness as a core value because kindness is, and I'm very specific about kindness is not niceness. It's not a
No,
passive
not fake.
quality. Yeah, it's a conscious quality. It's an active quality. It's about the way you raise your kids to be conscious about other individuals and individuals who, you know, have a completely different life experience. Get your child to think beyond themselves. It's really about that empathy and you
And
know,
compassion, isn't it?
yeah,
It's a sort of combination.
and it's so important, and I think it's still essential in, you know, when you're talking having these conversations about race, especially thinking about the fact that, you know, everyone's on some kind of journey, and so if you can be kind along that journey, then we can sort of progress together as opposed to, you know, being divisive and, yeah, getting into toxic conversations.
And so, do you want to tell us a bit about your blog as well? Because you are ask a lot, you have your blog questions in your book that you answer, and they're really interesting, good questions. You know, like my son doesn't like his name. What am I going to do about that? He says he's going to change it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of people have told me that they love those sections of the book, which is kind of like Q&As at the end of each chapter, sort of pulling together questions that I've had from like my community and also like my peer group. And yeah, and I just thought, well, I'd try and cover a lot of the bases because race is just is such a huge topic. And there are so many angles and elements. Like in the book, I cover, you know, colorism and I
Yeah.
cover hair and, you know, name shaming and name prejudice and how to deal with all of that. So yeah, I just thought it was, you know, it would be helpful to have a Q&A format. But my blog is really about fun stuff to do in London. That's the core of it.
It's about time.
Yeah, babes about town.
It's very cool. Do you want to talk about colorism? And I mean, I've been aware of it for actually quite a long time, but maybe other people aren't.
Yeah, colorism. So colorism is just, I don't know if you would call it necessarily a byproduct of racism, because on some levels it's also its own separate ism, but it is very much tied to racism and racial hierarchy and this idea of white supremacy, whereby, you know, across the world in so many different
In
cultures,
Indian and so many cultures, yeah.
yeah, the darker you are, the more you're seen as less worthy or less beautiful or less, like very often there's studies that have shown that, for instance, if you're darker skinned, you're more likely to get a higher criminal sentence. These are actual studies that have been shown. And so obviously then we see it across the media. If you've grown up black and a black woman, you've seen colorism sort of thrust at you from all the like Hollywood movies in which a very, very light-skinned woman is cast, or very, very, that's basically light-skinned black person with light-skinned black person, and you don't really exist. So there's a lot to do with ideas of what is considered valuable, what is considered, and it's all, a lot of it is that proximity to whiteness, and whiteness being seen as, the top of the pyramid. And, a lot is changing now, which is great, but it is still an issue, and it's an issue that needs to be discussed because it affects our kids as well.
And Mercer Derry is saying the topic of colorism is a sad one, even amongst black people. I mean, there was a story in your book about when you went to Nigeria and the guy at the passport desk. Do you want to say about that? Because it's not just white. It's not that it kind of
Yeah.
spreads itself colorism, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, this was more me illustrating the experiences I've had of being, and I was having this conversation with my kids the other day as well, because we were watching an episode of Jane the Virgin. I don't know if you've ever
You were
seen
watching what?
Jane the Virgin. So
No.
we often when we're watching TV shows together. So we're watching Jane the Virgin, and the main character, she's Latina, and she's walking with her stepdaughters, and she enters some building, and they assume she's the nanny. And so my boys were like, "Oh, that's so rude. Why would they do that?" So I said to them, "Well, that happened to me when you were much younger." And they were like, "How is that possible? Like, we look exactly like you. Why would anyone think you're a nanny?" I'm like, "Well, I would walk around with you," and they were both very light skinned, especially when they were babies. And there's me, and some people would just assume, they make these assumptions. And when I went to Nigeria for the first time with my eldest when he was about 10 months old, and I always say he looked like, I guess, completely different racial origin to me. And I had so many people coming up to me like, "Who is this baby? Where did you get him from? How do you
brought him from somewhere?"
And I'm like, I'm his mom. And it just happened to the point where it was like sometimes amusing, sometimes just really annoying. But it is one of those.
So almost like you needed to have a badge, like, this is my child. I'm this child's mum. Don't ask me anymore.
I have not stolen him. And my friend who was Indian, she said that she had the same experience, that when she went with her daughter, whose father is white English, and she went with her daughter to India. She said when she's with her daughter by herself, she'd have people like coming up to her in the street. And she said it's only when her husband was with them, they were like, "Oh, now we understand why you have this child who doesn't look exactly the same race as you." So yeah, it's just an interesting journey.
Yeah. And also the kind of audacity to ask these questions to somebody you never met.
That's the thing that just blows my mind. Is the sheer audacity. Like when I talk about hair as well, and like the amount of people that just would just plunge their hands into my son's hair in the street, complete strangers. And I'm thinking to myself, how, like, I would not even have
touch anybody's hair,
go up to anyone, let alone a stranger's child, and just put my hand in the hair and be like, "Wow, I love this hair." No, do not do that.
No, it's intrusive. So I think Ionius, I don't know if I said your name wrong. I'm so sorry if I have. You said I'm Asian and dark skin. Is that double minority in the West? I mean, maybe you know that as the person who's asking the question. Do you feel like it's a double minority? I don't know. Shall we end on something kind of that, I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And it's funny, you're funny. I don't know what would the be to people who are watching, what is it you think that they'll find when they read this book?
What will you find? I think you'll find a lot of interesting stories because
Yeah.
I wanted to start with stories and personal stories because I think that stories are teachers, and I didn't want it to be some kind of dry academic tome around race that was really serious and heavy going.
It's very
So,
personal. And you have a wonderful way, you have a wonderful voice as a writer that feels like you. I felt like I got to know you.
oh, thank you. Um, yeah, so that's it. I wanted it to be sort of conversational and open. Like it's meant to invite you into conversation. I'm not trying to preach at you. I'm not trying to hit you over the head with
Yeah.
stuff. I just
It's
want you
very
to,
relational. It is much less, I've read some books that at the end you kind of think, I know I had to read this and I just, I have to kind of let myself feel the hard things and read the hard things, but I do also feel like I've been beaten on the head quite a bit. And yours is much warmer than that. It is much more relational. It's like, this is my story of me as a black woman with that's lived in England, London, and Nigeria, of my husband who has a mixed heritage, and my children. And this is the roots of why we are experiencing what we're experiencing right now.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And hopefully it's quite actionable as well in terms of like these are the conversations that you can have with your kids and these are the reasons why. And hopefully, my goal is to fill people with some element of hope. There are some really painful stories in the book,
yeah, there are.
inevitably, but I wanted people to feel hopeful and to feel empowered, like you could do something about this. You don't have to just sit
Yeah.
down, raise your hands, and say, "Oh, isn't racism terrible?" It's like, no, I can actually get up and change things in some small way.
And that is the gift of your book, is that we're all part of the answer, and we can all do small things and bigger things. And as Nikki May Writer is saying, it's exceptionally actionable. And so thank you for giving us this gift of a book, and I hope and encourage many people to read it. And I hope I meet you one day, Uju. I think you live near my daughter.
Ah, great. Yeah, well, it would be lovely to meet you. That would be
And
fantastic.
so thank you for joining me, and good luck in all the things that you do.
And good luck to you with your book. I'm loving your book, so I'm looking
Are
forward
you?
to
Oh, good.
it.
Thank you. All righty. Well, take care. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and for your comments.
Thank you.
Um, and we'll see you soon. All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.